that, we're gonna have a set of questions that we want to ask that will kind of give our audience a general overview of your project and where it began. But first, I'd like to have each of you, starting with Logan Square, just give a quick 2 to 3 minute overview of the Logan Square cooperative activities. And Audrey, why don't you begin?
See that. So thank you very much for this opportunity to talk this morning. We have a great panel to talk about our cooperative. We're the Logan Square Cooperative, even though we are technically in Avondale at Diversity and Pulaski. We were founded in 2001. We're a limited equity co-op, so members own a share of the building. We were financed through a 10-year loan from CCLF and NCDF, which is now shared capital. Members bought in with anywhere from 0 to 50,000. There were 5K share loans available at the time for those who didn't have money to buy in. Over our history, we've refinanced twice. Our transfer value is what the members have paid in principal on the mortgage and the cost of some initial improvements to our bathrooms and kitchens, which have a capped value. We're self-managed. We're only 8 units. So we have 1 3-bedroom, 1 2-bedroom, 1 studio, and 5 1-bedrooms. Currently, we're 12 adults, 2 teenagers, 2 dogs, and 6 cats. That's very important. 1/3 of our founding members continue to live up here. We've had 1/3 of the units have turned over at one time, and the math isn't completely right on this, but 1/3 have turned over twice in our 20-year history. We're governed by bylaws, occupancy agreement, and principles of unity. We make decisions consensus -1 on most decisions, except for really large decisions such as the selling of the building. That has to be a unanimous decision. And we're also members of the Logan Square and Avondale neighborhood associations in terms of advocacy, both locally and in the city. So that's kind of an overview of who the Logan Square Co-op is at this time.
Thank you, Audrey. And next.
Okay, so I'm Jen Parks. I'm the Executive Director for Habitat for Humanity Chicago. We actually serve in a different role. We provide technical assistance to a cooperative that's called Winthrop Apartments Cooperative. It's an 18-unit apartment building in the Edgewater neighborhood. Originally, we developed this property back in the early 90s, and it was financed. It was a tax credit building, and it was financed by a couple different entities here in Chicago. And it continued to operate as an apartment building as long as until that 15-year tax credit period expired. And then subsequent to that, it continued to operate as an apartment building until about 10 years ago, I came into town and assumed leadership of the local habitat, and the residents of the building reached out to me and said, we want to, we were told we were going to be owners and we're still not owners. Can we meet and talk about that? And so we started a conversation with the people who lived in the building, of which many were original residents going back to the early 90s. And we started a journey of evaluation of what options existed for the people living in the building who wanted to go co-op, cooperative. And we brought in some expertise and helped to evaluate that decision. Went through some various scenarios, and ultimately the residents decided that they wanted to become a limited equity cooperative. So that transition happened in 2015, and they've operated as a limited cooperative ever since then. Everybody in the building decided to become a member, and there's been very low turnover since the original folks moved in. Year over year, the residents have largely stayed the same. We might have every 2 to 3 years, maybe one person changes out, but that's, again, which there have been living there since the early 90s. I would say the other thing that, again, our role as Habitat Chicago is to provide technical assistance. So I support the board of directors and connecting with them, making sure that we're following bylaws, making sure that we're staying attuned to issues of compliance. There, it still has financing from two partners here in Chicago, IDA and Chicago Community Loan Fund, who've helped provide financing over the life of the building. And I guess I would say the one other thing I would share is that, they've gone through some property management changes. And I think that's one of the things that we're trying to make sure that long-term, they do have a property manager they're not self-managed, they do have a property manager. So just helping them navigate working with a property manager and how to make sure they're getting what they need from the property manager while at the same time can continue to expand on continue their mission as a limited equity cooperative.
Thank you, Jen. That was great. Next, Ivan, can you give us overview of the Pilson Housing Cooperative?
Absolutely. Yeah. The Pilson Housing Cooperative, we started as a scattered site limited equity co-op for longtime residents of Pilson. And that began in conversations with neighbors starting around 2018. And like the neighborhood of Pilson, PICO, which is the acronym we go by, we're majority Latino. All but one of our current families have Latino householders, the one exception being the previous building owner who's lived on the property since 1967. He's first a tenant, then an owner, and now is a co-op owner. And the co-op was formed by artists and families with deep ties to the neighborhood. And we see the co-op very importantly as a stand against gentrification and displacement. Pilson is going through a lot of changes at the moment. And we see it as also as an expansion of homeownership by longtime Pilson residents and a concrete kind of manifestation of the strength of our community. One of the things that makes PICO unique is that we got our first building, which was a 6-unit property in February of 2020, but we've always had the goal of growing beyond a single building. And right now we're currently under contract for our second building. And so we want to and continue to look for other opportunities to build the co-op. We have over 30 families that have applied and are part of, and this weekend, a lot of other PICO members are actually at orientations for families who are interested. So we continue to grow the co-op and are looking forward to finalizing that second building and getting on to looking for our third building.
Thank you. Next up is Molly at POAH. Molly.
Good morning, everybody. So the inclusion of POAH in this panel is very generous because we haven't developed a shared equity building yet, but we've been working with the Center for Shared Ownership and with women and with Janae and Rachel over the past year as we start to plan for a proposal to build a 30-unit shared equity building in Garfield Park. We were the recipients of a development competition from the city of Chicago designed around a sustainable development concept. And we saw sustainability at number one is sort of energy efficiency and solar, renewables, looking at, very affordable living configurations for residents, but also as an opportunity for equity, an opportunity, and took that challenge very much from the neighborhood. There was some direction given from stakeholders in the neighborhood to build some kind of shared equity or limited equity product there. So it was always going to be a little bit of a long runway for us. It's a 2-phase project. We're building an affordable rental building first, and have taken a lot of time to deliberately plan that in concert with community stakeholders. But the second building, the final phase of that project is a shared ownership project. So we're very much looking forward to building that and to kind of realizing that dream for the community. POAH is an affordable housing developer based in Boston and hasn't done a lot with ownership, but is very interested in this project. We worked in Woodlawn for about 10 years doing some redevelopment of affordable housing, built or renovated about 600 or 700 apartments, many for very low income people. But one of the most compelling things we did was to partner with CIC and NHS here in Chicago to do the renovation of 2 to 4 unit buildings to work to build equity for residents in the neighborhood at the request of surrounding homeowners, looking at buildings that needed a little bit of extra TLC and just to bring in some new homeowners and to foster new developers. And so that experience was very compelling. Of all the things we did in Woodlawn, that people the most. And so we recognize the importance of homeownership, shared ownership for the purposes of neighborhood revitalization. And so that's sort of given us some extra motivation to go down this journey. But I feel like I'm here above all to listen and learn from my fellow folks here today.
Thank you. And last but not least, Bickerdike. Joy, could you give us an overview of Bickerdike's co-op practice?
Of course. Good morning, everyone. Bickerdike has a long history in developing affordable housing, and we started a project many years ago called the Erie Cooperative, and it arose because people wanted affordability, stability, and control. And in the at the time in the Westtown community, and people were wanted to do a co-op because it offered them all three of those things, and knowing that it would be difficult for people to qualify for a mortgage individually, they came together and said, we have to do this as a way to mitigate the forces of gentrification in our neighborhoods. And so we worked for a long time. We came up against the political opposition of the alderman at that time, who got himself unelected, I think largely due to this issue and his own behavior, and ended up moving it to an adjacent ward, and not because, not because, well, let me tell you why, because people were not going to be thwarted. And it's a long, really rich story about the importance of fighting for affordable housing and how to achieve it. But I think in this case specifically, the dedication of these individuals who wanted this cooperative was so powerful. And we were driven completely by them as a community-driven organization. And so eventually we did build it in the Humboldt Park community in Walter Burnett's ward. And the committee thought that they were going to have to go and meet with the alderman and have a big fight. And when they sat down with him, he said, "Oh, absolutely. Yeah, let's do that." And it's a really beautiful thing, because this was at the time the largest density of vacant land in Humboldt Park. And while we were under construction, the alderman was getting all these calls about, "Hey, why are you letting all this high-priced housing, these condos, be developed in our neighborhood?" And he said, no, this is affordable housing. And so I think, starting with the need for affordable housing, and how co-ops can be a way to give people stability, affordability, and control, as well as be a mitigating force to gentrification, as well as community revitalization. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Joy. For the audience, you've heard 5 extraordinary stories. And as I listen to each of the presenters, and I'll start with Joy, who ended us, is that co-ops have an absolutely great success of being anti-displacement and gentrification. Mm-hmm. And what Joy is talking about, those early days that Bickerdike, Chicago Rehab Network, were on the front lines of pushing back against city policy. I was going to say silly policy was that too, as well as wealthy real estate interests whose intention was to turn all of those lakefront communities into upper income communities, and to force out working people, minorities, the large Native American population, the large Latinx population that had lived there for decades and decades. And but for that fight around a strategy of development without displacement, many of these neighborhoods would look so different. And in every situation, co-ops was the practical proposal put on the table as the alternative to simply gentrifying communities and forcing working families into homelessness. And so what I'd like to do is ask each of you a series of questions, given some of the differences in your approaches and the type of co-op. And Joy, ending with you, I'm going to begin with you. And could you talk about just the process Bickerdike uses in acquiring buildings for co-ops, and where do you get the necessary capital to get site control?
Yeah, it's a big issue, and it may not be altogether a traditional model, but I think one that I think does mirror a lot of affordable housing. So land acquisition is a serious thing, and let me tell you, just as an entry into my answer, when we first started doing this, Chicago had plenty of co-ops, but Chicago was very anti-co-op. And meaning the city of Chicago did not have any favorable vision or support of co-ops. They didn't understand it. They didn't like it. They acted like there wasn't any in Chicago, which was not true. And so that began to be the uphill battle. I think land acquisition is a big deal. And initially, for the site in Westtown where we started, there we got small, pre-development capital through the Chicago Community Loan Fund and looked for a combination of both city-owned as well as privately owned land. And we paid market price for some of the lots for the project, since it was a new construction project. And in the end, when we ended up moving it, I have to tell you, that was one of the big, I came right at the beginning of the development of the project. By the way, it went to a referendum on the ballot for city council, in that ward. And we won. And even though we won, the alderman still reneged on his promise. And so that's kind of left us high and dry. When we went to the 27th ward, Walter Burnett was like, yeah, we got to make this thing happen. Here, I have all this sort of density of city land right here. Let's do it there. And so the Erie Co-op, which was renamed Harold Washington Unity Co-op, ended up being built on, it was 18 buildings, which I don't advise, by the way, and on vacant city land. And that allowed us to bring down and control some of the costs for the project, because costs can be a huge issue. And everyone will come at it a different way. And I just as a in wearing a different hat, but still me, I'm also part of the Chicago Community Land Trust, and which is a quasi-governmental city of Chicago body. And we have really started to get into an acquisition rehab program for homes that will go on the trust. And they're not co-op at the moment, but they're affordable. And this is a real struggle, land and building acquisition. And we've been looking for maybe not the perfect, most beautiful homes, but for homes that make sense for acquisition and rehab that can then turn around and be operated at an affordable price. That was a long answer. So.
Thank you. And Molly, you had mentioned you had purchased a 30-unit building. Could you talk about what sources of dollars you were able to assemble to acquire your first property?
Sure. Well, so similar to Harold Washington Co-op, this is a new construction project. So we were awarded development rights to the land through a city competition. The Department of Planning and Development put it out and kind of based on some neighborhood concepts for shared ownership and kind of aligning with those plans, we were awarded the opportunity and option to develop the land, which is about 3/4 of an acre. So it's all owned by the city, which is a really great opportunity because we haven't built anything yet. We're looking at many sources of funds. The layer cake, familiar to anybody working in affordable housing and co-op housing, scrimping and saving and trying to pull things together. But the fact that it is land and not an existing building, I think speaks to one of maybe the central challenges here. And I think there's a lot of inherent affordability for co-ops when they're an existing building. When you buy in like Audrey's group, or you buy in like the group that came to Jen in the former affordable housing building. So I think we're looking at an expensive building, which isn't an easy road, but I think we're also looking at multiple goals. We're looking at an environmentally sustainable building. We're looking at neighborhood regeneration, leading with affordable housing, leading with community ownership. And those are all public goods beyond even, affordable housing. So we're looking at an expensive building, but a very, very worthwhile one. And so some of the sources of funding we're looking at, obviously, CCLF was one of the first people to believe in this concept and to give us a letter of interest. But we're looking at HUD loans, share loans for participants. The city of Chicago has an affordable requirements ordinance that requires developers of market rate, getting zoning benefits, market rate.
Sorry, you know what?
Oh,
This thing just came on. I forgot I'm supposed to have been on a conference since 10 o'clock.
Hello.
Hi, Miss Geraldine. One of our partners.
Hi, good morning.
Our co-part. Good morning.
Geraldine, could you please mute, please?
Give
Thank
me.
you.
So looking at
Go
many
ahead,
sources
Molly.
of funding, looking at many sources of funding, I think there are foundations in Chicago that will award funds to nonprofits building deeply energy efficient buildings. So we're looking at to take advantage of that, building the project as a nonprofit, looking to take advantage to partner with private developers that are building market rate housing that in order to receive zoning benefits have to put funds into an affordable project elsewhere, but looking at home ownership funds from the Illinois Housing Development Authority. We've had some interest talking to community about sort of some kind of community equity fund. So some small piece of it being shares from people that don't live there. So we're still putting together that financing, but we're pretty optimistic, but a lot of layers and a lot of unconventional layers as well.
Thank you, Molly. And Ivan, you have a small scattered site co-op. Tell us about, you had mentioned how you got your first building. How did you raise your capital?
Yeah, and even in terms of how we acquired our first building, really it was relationships with neighbors, right? We, the owner who then became a co-op member, he heard about the PICO project through conversations together in the neighborhood. And, he had been a long-term owner and, saw this as a way, for example, to have to release his need to keep up with the building, to maintain the building, and instead to stay in the Pilson community as well, and to continue to live there, and at the same time now have collective ownership over the building. And so the way we acquired that first building, though, as pretty much all of the ways we're looking to expand the cooperative, was with member equity. We collected $92,000 in member equity. Our smallest down payment was $2,000 for that, and did $6,000 of fundraising as well. So we got to around $98,000 of cash. Again, the seller stayed on the property, and not only that, part of the important ways in which we were able to do it is they bought their share outright. And so that made a big difference in terms of, things that banks care about, the loan ratio, et cetera. And so that allowed, that collective pooling of resources is really the way in which we were able to acquire this property. And to address a little bit of what Sheila from Hub asked in the text about property acquisition, when you're competing with developers, cash buyers, investors, we are using all the avenues we can to find properties, even as the housing market prices in our community are skyrocketing. The second building that we're under contract for was on the market. Again, pooling resources made us competitive, but with those those rising prices, it was hard to do. But the most important thing here is that we had conversations with the owner, who also owns other properties in the neighborhood, and we really talked to them about their legacy. What do they want to leave the community with? And how do they want to be known and understood? there in Pilson. And so that made a big difference in terms of why we were the folks, even though we may not have had the highest, dollars to put down on the table, but we had a competitive bid and they went with us. They wanted to see this project come through and to really say that they helped support, residents to be able to stay in Pilson. And like Molly, we're working with the city as well to see if we can get ARO funding for this project. But currently at the moment, some of that is not the easiest avenue. So we have to talk a lot, and I know we have been talking the first day about policy and policy changes and how we can, do better in terms of helping right now in the midst of this housing crisis for things like co-ops to be able to expand and to continue to grow. And I'll leave it there for the moment.
Thank you. And Jen, could you talk about Habitat? And again, Habitat is also a bit different than some of the other panelists, but you use LIHTC in your 18-unit building. And so could you talk about how you raised the capital in that model? Because even with LIHTC, you still have some of the same issues of raising necessary capital beyond the investor capital that comes from the credit.
Yeah, I can speak to a little bit from a historical perspective. I can share, I was not here when it was originally developed, so I had predecessors to me put together that financing and created it was a partnership model, your limited partner, so you had your various partners and pulled together the financing from a couple of different institutions here in Chicago, and used LIHTC to help be one of those tools to help provide the financing on it. I mean, the challenge I have in terms of I inherited it, and so like when I came into my role, those tax credits had expired, and essentially Habitat outright owned the building. We had paid off the debt to some of the financing partners, or continued to pay down the debt from some of those early financing partners. And so the thing that we had to figure out is, well, how do we transition this? And so could the building be financially healthy, and transferring it from Habitat owning it to the residents of the building and creating this cooperative? And so that was when I was really involved in that transfer. And as Habitat, we made a decision early on that we wanted to maintain this building as, it's in Edgewater. We wanted to continue to be an affordable housing development. It's in a neighborhood with access. I mean, literally the red line is right behind it. So ease of access to transportation, ease of access to jobs, lots of amenities in the neighborhood. The neighborhood changed quite a bit over the years. And so there was just a place where we wanted to maintain that as an affordable housing development. And so our challenge as Habitat is, okay, how do we, this major asset, how do we, are we okay just transferring it over and making sure it's going to continue to be able to be managed and financially healthy? We went out and talked to, we worked with Chicago Community Loan Fund, which helped us finance. One of the big issues we had was the roof needed to be fully replaced. So in assessing the health of the building, it had been developed in the early 90s. It, had been maintained well. However, it did need a new roof. And so that was the big capital investment that we needed to be able to maintain the health of the building. And we were able to secure financing from CCLF, and then add that to the already existing financing that was still on the building, which was at this point through IDA. And between CCLF and IDA, we were able to move all that debt and transfer that over. And still to this day, the cooperative is paying down that debt on both of those. So I don't know if it doesn't really tell you how the original financing was put together, because again, that does predate me. But when it came time to the transfer, we had to look at how do we put together bring in new financing partners for that, that roof replacement, while at the same time, could the building, handle the debt that it already had with new debt and still financially be successful? And it had plenty of reserves, which was good. It still maintains plenty of reserves. And it had a very strong history of payables. So, people, the carrying charges are reliably, people were really good about paying those carrying charges every month. So it was able to carry the additional debt and maintain the building based on all the financial work. And that's still the case to this day.
And Jen, just a follow-up. It was 15 years rental housing under the LIHTC agreement. And then at the end of that period, it was ultimately transferred and converted to a co-op from that point forward.
Right. We had to let those 15 years expire before it could become a co-op. When I did my history and looked into the original organizing documents around Winthrop, it was always envisioned that it would become a cooperative. So even the original materials that went to residents back in the early 90s was, this will eventually become a cooperative, but you had to let those 15 years, those tax credits expire before you could contemplate that. And those 15 years went by, and the Habitat was not in a place to make it, do that work until I came on board. And then we started to have those discussions. And frankly, because the residents of the building said, we want to talk. We want to become owners. And they had that legacy and that history of those early days of saying, we were going to be owners. We still want to be owners. And so that was the process that we started to engage with back in 2013, 14.
Mm-hmm. And thank you. And Audrey, the same question for you. You refinanced twice, but could you talk about how Logan Square Cooperative was able to finance the original set of units, 8 units, and then how you handled your refinancing after that?
Yes, so we looked for about 2 years or more for a building, and there was a core group that looked. And when we found the building, we went to the Chicago Community Loan Fund. So the Chicago Community Loan Fund and the North Country, I forget what the D stands for, fund. They're now called Shared Capital up in Minnesota, provided our a loan with them. And then individual members had varying degrees of ability to, to buy in anywhere from nothing to 50,000. And although nobody paid 50,000, so I don't know why that number's there. But anyway, we also had people who had no real savings and no ability to do that, which was why they were renting and not buying. So share loans were also available at the time through NCDF of 5,000. So people were able to get those loans and then pay those back over time. So that's how we financed our building originally. And we've always had a long-term capital. We've always made sure that we are setting money aside and that we set our monthly housing charges in terms of paying down the principal and the interest, but also putting money aside for longer term capital needs, which we have had to call upon to use. The first time we refinanced, we decided we were going to be all, urban about it. We were going to look for something else. We were going to look for something besides CCLF. There had to be something besides CCLF out there because we didn't think what they were offering us. They couldn't offer us, I don't know if Calvin's talking about, but they couldn't offer us a 10-year, another 10-year loan. And so what they were offering us was something less than that. And we were just convinced that the time had come that the, banks would be, at the time that we bought the building, individual members had to go to a bank and get basically approved for a mortgage. This idea of co-ops was just so foreign to banks, as it was 10 years later, at least up on the north side. We went to so many banks, big banks like Chase, smaller banks like our own community banks on the north side. And none of them were having it. It was just this foreign concept. They couldn't get past the idea that it was memberships, that it wasn't a condo. So in the end, we went back to CCLF and we refinanced with CCLF. And then more recently, we refinanced with Shared Capital. They were providing something more competitive, and each time it offered people the opportunity, if they wanted, to put more towards their own principles. So if people had saved up a little bit, had something they wanted to add that to their principal, they did so. So that's how we, we have managed. And for new members buying in, again, there are still some opportunities for shared loans, but we've also at times kind of financed internally that initial loan for people, just because we want to make sure that people with, that don't have those savings, that don't have that money, are able to buy in and begin to experience the joy of co-op ownership together.
Thank you. And that's a great segue into equity. And so these are questions I want to ask everyone. And again, starting with you, Audrey, walk us through what were the, if you recall, the original equity requirements, and the broader question for each of you beyond kind of what were those equity requirements, was the equity requirements necessary to make sense and viability of your project paid a price that limit who could come in by virtue of the demands of the amount of capital it had to bring. So Audrey, what level of equity and what impact did your equity requirements have on affordability, if that was important?
I think in some ways it wasn't important. Our goal was, one, we wanted to, all of us were motivated by the fact that we had rented for years. We were renters, and we're just constantly being priced out of, Rogers Park, Logan Square. I mean, all these kind of North Side communities that we had been living in. And so we wanted to make sure that it was affordable and affordable in perpetuity. So that's why it's limited equity. So, in terms of, one of the questions was, how do people build equity? And that's not really the priority. And also the goal was, we didn't want people coming and going. So we didn't want members seeing the building as a, what do you call it?
Kind of a way station here today, but gone.
Yeah, and a way to build we're going to make these improvements and then we can sell our unit for, like you would have flip it. Yeah. And even if somebody stayed a long time, we didn't want that. We wanted people to have enough of an investment that really it was more economical for them to stay than to go. So, when somebody leaves now, they get their member, what they have paid in principal on the mortgage and the cost of any initial bathroom and kitchen improvements they did, but there's a cap on that of like $10,000. So even if they spent $25,000, in renovation or whatever, they're not going to get that back. So I think for us, the issue was, how do we keep the building affordable, and how do we make sure that when people, when we have an opening, that we are able to offer it to folks who do not, might only be able to come with a couple $1,000s to buy in.
And Audrey, your articles and your members all agree that Logan Square Cooperative would have the first right to buy their share if they were looking to move or leave.
Yes. Okay. Yes. And we've done different things when people have needed to leave or wanted to leave. We have people have the option of finding another member, which the whole co-op needs to approve. That's what we did most recently when we had a member pass, was her sons actually knew somebody who worked at the Logan Square Neighborhood Association that we all knew, was looking for a co-op. So the family or, the person leaving can find someone else, or we've also purchased the unit ourselves. So we've had a couple of occasions when people had job opportunities and they left fairly quickly, or it was a little bit messy, and we decided it was in our collective best interest to buy the membership ourselves and then take our time to find a new member. And we have even rented. We've even had one unit where we rented for a period of time while we looked for a new member.
Thank you. And Jen, what's your equity program? What is the requirement for members coming in? How much cash do they need to bring?
Yeah, we are, Winthrop is a very different, it's a very affordable equity share that people need to purchase a share to get in. For a 2-bedroom, the membership fee is $942. For a 3-bedroom, it's $1,087. So it's not a heavy lift to become an initial member. They do have requirements around training. So to become you have to pay that share price, and then you also have to attend training to become a full member.
How many hours?
And actually there's a certain number of classes. So there's a curriculum that already exists, and so they have to complete a certain number of classes in order to become a full member.
Okay.
And then once they do that, they get their certificate of membership. And then it's maintaining your monthly carrying charges. And it's not, and I think the other piece that I would offer is that it's really not, even though people are assigned units, I mean, again, it's as a cooperative model, it's not your unit, you're assigned a unit in the building. And so, if there's any issues of repair, I mean, everything is managed by the property management company and then approvals by the board for budgeting and such. So if there's any changes with units, and a unit, somebody moving out, we just had somebody move out recently. They buy that share back from the unit, from the unit holder, but they don't necessarily, then they're going to look for another resident to take on membership. Who might come from a wait list of people who've expressed interest. So,
and Jen, is there some appreciation that accrues to the member equity, and what is that, and how is it calculated?
Yeah, so within the bylaws, all of those membership fees are held in a separate bank account that not allowed to be touched. They're all held separately, and if when somebody moves out, they get a proportionate share of the interest that's been gained on that bank account based on the size of their unit. So it's a very small amount of interest. And so it's not, the mission here is it's not to provide a lot of money for folks to walk away with. It's really more, because it's not a market rate cooperative, it's really about making an affordable long-term place for people to live, and so that they can then use their income and resources in other ways. So yeah, but they do get, it's a proportionate share of the interest. They get member share plus the proportionate share of interest on that.
Mm-hmm. And Ivan, what's your experience on your equity for your members in PICO?
Yeah, you'll hear some similar things on our end, but we really start with the fact that like home and co-op ownership for us needed to be easier to access than need a policy degree. None of us had that. None of us had an accounting degree. So we really listened to others, especially Logan Square Co-op. We spent a lot of time talking with other folks. And so the way we determined our share price was just to take the total project cost, the cost of the building, rehab, closing costs, and divided that into each apartment by square footage. That meant that our highest share price in our first building was around $150,000, the largest apartment, and our lower price share was $73,000 in the smallest apartment. And as you heard before, someone came in with $2,000 down payment. And so we took that kind of individual motivation to help the collective. If you can pay in higher, you help someone that cannot pay as much come in. And that's kind of how we were able to do that. But we are limited equity, and the way that works is that all the principal that someone puts in is returned upon the transfer of the share. And the way we've kind of calculated is around $8,000 in equity on average after about 5 years. And this formula for all of our members is easy to calculate. All of the share owners can tell you what their shares are worth and the kind of equity they have. We do see it as a way to build Latinx wealth, so that rather than be paying kind of carrying charges and have to wait for a full mortgage on a building to be paid off, you can pay your share independently. And equity is built by paying down the principal, via the down payment, monthly mortgage payment, or extra payments towards the principal. We do offer zero appreciation on shares, and that's really the way we thought about in terms of preserving the affordability. So, as kind of others have mentioned, the real benefit of PECO housing comes not when you sell, which is really the way a lot of people think about housing in the United States, but rather when you stay, right? And those shares can go to family members, in other words, but, we're really trying to find ways to have people who have for a long time made Pilson their home continue to make Pilson their home, and to maintain the kind of cultural roots of folks in the neighborhood that's very rapidly gentrifying.
That's really very important what you said. Tell me, in the situation where you had some members that could only provide $2,000 and others provided more, how did that translate on the side of the appreciation of what they would get back? Did they get back the proportion based on the 2,000, or was it based upon, again, a formula that was tied to that square footage?
Yeah, it's essentially tied to the square footage, right? To the price of the unit. So over time, right? Someone who comes in at $2,000 still has the same capacity to build, that level of equity. They're just doing it at a different pace, at a different rate, and and to their capacity. So it's really it remains the same. So whether or not you're at the on the second unit on the top floor with 2 bathrooms, or you're down in a lower unit with 1 bathroom and smaller square footage, it's equal in that way for all members.
Yeah, and for the audience, this is really important. When you're in a co-op, all the members' ownership are equal. And Audrey, that is actually part of why capitalism has a problem with co-ops, because equity is not a typical, I could be Rockefeller and you could be Audrey with $1 in your pocket. And in a co-op, whether you Audrey with $1 in your pocket and I'm Rockefeller, in the example you gave, Ivan, in the co-op, we are all equal, regardless of the amount of capital we have. And that is an important point. Now, I have a theory for the audience on why Chicago hates co-ops. 100 years ago, tied to the beginning of the Civil War, Chicago was heavily Irish American, and they were pro-Confederates. The new European immigrants were Germans who were socialist Christians and were abolitionists. And because the Germans were abolitionists and the Irish, who dominated and controlled the city, were pro-slavery, they had this view that the Germans had these odd ideas around that the first riot in Chicago wasn't riots done by Latinx or African Americans, but Germans in the early 1860s, when the Irish decided to close down the beer halls to punish the Germans for their position on abolition. So this view of co-ops in the local community government being opposed to it exists in a lot of places. Even in a place like Milwaukee, where the Germans actually came and dominated, and you still have this view that co-ops are somehow other to American capitalism. And of course, it is simply another way in which people can own and control their housing. Molly, tell us about your equity procedures. How much does it cost for someone to come into your co-op, and how do you handle when they exit? What do they receive?
Yeah, so we're looking at something a little bit different. Again, it's really early, but we're looking at it something more closer to a condo model, but though not a condo model, that people would pay in like about a third of the cost of the building would be from resident equity, which would be financed at a cost comparable to probably a condominium at like $100,000, affordable to someone at 30-50% of AMI. And that would be financed with a share loan of some type. And so that person's equity upon leaving would be the principal on that loan. But again, we're very early in trying to figure this out, and I'm not very articulate in explaining it. So, but I think we're looking at some limitation of equity, but probably a little bit of a heavier lift and something that can be financed with little to no money down, but that would sort of lean more heavily on what someone could borrow in order to buy in.
So,
Are you concerned that your equity structure could, again, where you're looking at equity being a third of the cost of the building, impacting the affordability of your members?
Yeah, I mean, really, I mean, I'm pretty folks who are, be able to take people that can come in with $1,000, with $500. I think we would like to be there in terms of what we would accept on day one, but are also looking to use loans to help people buy in. So I think the price points and the incomes that we're targeting are very much in line with where the neighborhood is. But yeah, I think it's we still have really want to safeguard that and really want it to be successful for people. So we have some work to do.
For Bickerdike, how have you handled the issue of equity, and how do you handle a member exit, and what do they receive upon that exit? Take yourself off of mute.
Yeah,
Dave.
it surely does help to hear, doesn't it? We made our share price the same as the monthly carrying costs. And I do want to just mention one thing, even though it's not completely on target with your question, but part of the monthly share that we did is ours limited equity co-op. And we had a carve out for a sinking fund that could be executed at year 15, which I think is a really important thing, because you have to figure year 15 out, trust me, in a limited equity co-op. But our share costs were the same as the monthly carrying costs. And we, because, and here's another thing that I would not do, we did an FHA insured loan. We did two co-ops, by the way. One of them we did with an FHA insured loan, which ended up to be a terrible idea because they treated, you have to meet all the same requirements as a, essentially as a Section 8 building. And so you have REAC inspections, and it's, yeah, don't do that. And
for the audience, if you heard the HUD presentation yesterday, Joy just explained why the only deals that HUD are doing is upper middle class senior housing. Because those are the only projects that can meet their regulatory requirement that turns into revenue you must spend to meet their ongoing standard. I'm sorry, Joy, please go ahead.
No, that's okay. They also, by the way, just to speak to your point, they also told us that we could not make the share purchase mandatory. Go figure, right? They
Run that by me again, I'm sorry.
Make it mandatory, yeah. HUD said you cannot make the share purchase mandatory because it was an FHA insured deal, and it had low-income housing tax credits, and therefore, and I honestly, I feel like this was, this project, by the way, was done in the early 2000s. And I feel like they were making stuff up, honest to God. I think they were just making stuff up. And that's why I say there's a lot more,
that may be,
I think, commitment by a lot of people to remove barriers to a certain extent to get co-ops done. But we were one of the very early on limited equity co-ops, and I cannot tell you how many things we had to peel back to get it to work. We had a controlled appreciation, which that was, in the case of this project, benchmarked to the market, which was different than how the other co-op that we did, which was benchmarked to just a straightforward flat appreciation. Now, when the market tanked, this was a terrible thing because people's share values were much higher than, that wasn't me. But that made it really difficult for people to come in afterward because the share prices were much higher. And I know at some point we'll be able to talk about co-op member education, but or maybe it's on another panel, but boy, I cannot stress enough the importance of co-op member education around.
Well, it's funny you said that, because that is actually our next question. But before that, it's something you said that's important. So the deal you're referring to had FHA mortgage insurance and was LIHTC.
Mm-hmm.
So you actually had two 800-pound gorillas. You had the tax credit investors who only care about themselves and care nothing about the co-op. And you had HUD and your lender who only considered about their mortgage and nothing else. So you had to balance those two. That probably had a lot to do with some of the get up as you go rules that you got from HUD.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and by way of disclosure, we ended up deconverting the co-op because there were so many barriers to its success. And so I begged Rachel not to put me on this panel, but she said that I had things to add nonetheless. And so I'll wait until the next question to.
Well, Joy, you do, because both successes, failures, and struggles are all part of what we need to learn. And your experience is really important. That's why we're here, for somebody to hear what you just said, who might be looking at talking to those two 800-pound gorillas. So with that said, let's talk about education. What did you do? And given how long you guys have been at it, what would you do different now than when you started?
Absolutely. And so the first co-op that we did, we worked in tandem and even in financial partnership with the Chicago Mutual Housing Network, and who was a huge proponent of co-ops. And we were very interested in working with them to do co-ops. And so their role was one of co-op member education and, the formation of the board. And in the end, unfortunately, that organization met with hardship and ended up shutting down. But it also left us in a situation where we had one project built and one project being built. And we were in the early stages of occupancy when this happened on the second project. And so we had a very difficult time. And so here's what we did. We hired property managers and educated the heck out of them. We were fortunate enough that the rehab network stepped in. Janae Moreno came out and did a lot of education with our co-op, and that is nothing bad about CMN or Janae, that what happened ultimately with the co-ops. But I think getting people to differentiate between apartment living and co-op living is critical, because it is different, and getting that buy-in, getting them to elect a board. And I will tell you that eventually one of the problems that we had, and this is why I say don't do an 87 unit co-op in 18 buildings, is it was difficult for people to feel like it was a co-op. And I think if you look at Noble Co-op, their buildings are all in a dense area. And even though ours was in a semi-dense area, there were a lot of buildings in between. And so it, even though we had enthusiastic property managers, even though I think we had initially enthusiastic residents, there's a lot of pressure with the low-income housing tax credit to get your units occupied. And so, you end up sacrificing the amount of education and preparation that you might do with, with eventually with the pressure to move people in, with the hopes that you'll be able to catch up afterward. And so, and then it ultimately, when you have a change in property manager, you have to educate your property manager as much as you do your residents, because ultimately you're relying on them to bring, new people in, and to, for those co-ops that are big enough to have a property manager. And so I think that, community engagement, I think initially we had a really strong engagement, and that sort of, with the passage of time, we couldn't get a legal board, and that really made it difficult to plan for year 15. And so I think there are, the CSO, honestly, I wish the CSO had been around. I wish Janae and the CRN had been able to, perform a miracle. I wish I had a magic wand, but I do, I think that, and I'm sure every single person on this panel, plus people in the audience, can really speak to the critical importance of educating people when they're buying into a co-op, whether they're buying, I think, not, by the way, not being able to make the share purchase mandatory was a terrible thing, and it hurt us. It really hurt us.
Right. Oh yeah, I understand that. I educate people that you might own the 747 co-op, but that don't mean you can fly the 747. And when I look at failed co-ops, most of the path to that failure was the things that Joy was talking about.
Wait a minute.
The ability to not address the education and people understanding what they're getting into, what their role is, what it means to be a member. Janae?
So 2 quick things I want to jump in is, thank you, Joy. Yes, we wish we were more able as the Chicago Rehab Network to be able to provide that need after the Chicago Mutual Housing Network defunct. But the other thing I want to make sure we pull out of this whole education stuff is it's ongoing. Right? It's not just today, it's ongoing. And many times in the pre-development budget, in the development budget, that education component is left as the stepchild and become important when there's a problem, right? And so I just want to reiterate and really emphasize, as you talk to the others, is what is the cost of doing business, right? And why does the education has to be seen as part of that equity component and part of your budget year in and year out? It's ongoing. The one thing the Mutual Housing Network used to do with its clients, right, was we came in as educators at least once a year prior to their annual meeting to educate the members on what is it that role means, because that's the one time that owners are making decisions as a collective. So it's ongoing, whether it's co-op, condo, townhomes, it is ongoing. And that budgeted item has to be as important as everything else in the infrastructure of the property.
The human development is the key, not the brick and mortar. The brick and mortar will be there. It's the people that makes a difference. And again, before moving to the posing the question of the panelists for the audience, Joy said something else. The part of doing this training that Janae is talking about, which means ongoing training through every phases. So back to my metaphor, you learn how to fly and get the plane in the air, but you still got to figure out how do you land it. And so you got to have long-term planning and ongoing refreshing planning. Co-ops I see have problems in year 4 to 6 because they've completed their training and they're now 2 years without any training. And those who are on the board who are trained are now being replaced by those who didn't get the same benefit. And you see it in the decisions people make because they're operating from ignorance of how to manage their corporation. And so
can I make another comment as well?
Please.
Because I think that one of the important things is to people are, part of that education is what does it mean to live in a co-op? What are the obligations of the co-op?
Right.
But and with the limited equity co-op, if you try to match people's investment with, in their share and the equity they build in their share with their obligations as a co-op member, it's not going to connect with them in the same way as being a quality, affordable place to live that they have control, through the board of directors, through their participation. And I think, as we look at the financialization of our our homes and real estate, it's an important distinction to make as in the context of co-op education.
I agree. And I would argue that when we look at how affordable home ownership is being ravaged across the country, there is the same issue. While it may not be co-ops, if you're buying a home, you still need that education. And part of the abuses that occurred was consumers not having knowledge of how the systems work and not having the necessary training, which again speaks to how critical the Center for Shared Ownership, because this is a critical service that's needed in the market on an ongoing basis. If you're going to grow co-ops, you simply got to grow the consumer's knowledge. And so, Molly, let's move to you. What's your experience? How do you handle training? And based on where you are now, what would you do different?
Again, we're really at the beginning of this, but I think before we've even looked at really planning a building, we have looked at the human development piece, kind of in talking to, working with Janae and Rachel. So we've identified some community partners, many of whom are on, or at least one of whom is on this call, who have been doing financial education, ownership education as a realtor with residents in the neighborhood for a long time. So we're looking to try to build a membership out of people that are interested, or they're coming to meetings interested in this concept, that are buying into the concept of shared ownership before they're buying into the idea of a building. So in some ways, replicating what Ivan and the Logan Square Cooperative have done. It's a people first sort of building later, but the intention to live together, the intention to find something more affordable than they could find otherwise in the neighborhood, who are committed to something. But I would say that is also kind of connected to place. It's connected to this other development that we're doing. That's a really interesting point about Noble Square and Harold Washington, that having the sense of place and centeredness and rootedness, because it's connected to another development, it's connected to retail, it's connected to investments in solar and other kind of, asset-based development in the neighborhood. So that's an interesting thing. I mean, I think it's people first, but place also matters too.
Absolutely.
And wait a minute, let me just say, and I know Molly is to me, Molly is really underselling what they're doing, the that they're doing. They're literally educating the community, not yet the buyer, right? Right. The community about what this can be and what is the community's role. And that helps create the market. It helps create the education It helps create the language,
Right.
right, of expectation of what this collective shared ownership opportunity can be for this place-based project. And I think though they don't have a brick, I don't even know that they have a site yet. They're beginning with the larger space of the community to then be able to begin control and dedication to this from that ground, from that foundational space.
Janae is absolutely right, Molly, and that is educating the community and doing that human development work long before you get to the brick and mortar is the item that will determine the success. And for the audience, there's this tension to want to do real estate development. And co-ops are really different because it really is about the members and the people and the community. And so while you're taking that bigger view, and I say that because my approach has been very similar to yours, Molly, it was a really funny space. But what came out of the community education were the people who said, I get it, I like it, I want to be part of that, as well as those who supported them. And so that it had the impact by educating the community, you elevate them and provide the basis for having a much greater chance for successful real estate. So what's your experience, Ivan?
It's similar in that sense that you really have to start with folks and people. So like I mentioned, I mean, other people in PICO this weekend are doing some of those trainings, bringing other people who might have heard about PICO, but want to learn more. And, you know, and it's not just the idea of PICO, right? It's also understanding what limited equity means and to really, you know, have that buy-in, because I think one of the things that's been really difficult, right? People want to obviously transition from being renters to being homeowners. That's something that we see, you know, from a lot of folks in the community, but how you get there is a very different thing. And more importantly, even understanding that we see the buildings that people are living in as their homes, right? Not as essentially, you know, a bank, right? Or a way to make money. And that's a very different thing. And so just being able to connect with people for whom, you know, other people in their community is, and that other people who you live with are an extension of your community, of your family, of your sense of place, you know, that is something that has to be cultivated, even as, you know, what we heard from, you know, even the first panel, right? It is something that lives in many Black and Latinx neighborhoods already, you know, that sense of having to support each other and mutual aid. But, you know, the sense of that, you know, our homes are the places where we cultivate our collective life and our living, et cetera, but they're not necessarily a site for capital. You know, it's something that we're running against kind of, you know, a lot of US history there, you know, in many senses. And so that's that sense of collective kind of understanding and buy into the project is initially really crucial. And then, you know, for those who then are part of the co-op, you know, monthly meetings where we are talking about everything, the technical aspects, where we're talking about, you know, what are the things that need repair in the building, who needs to do it, how do you do it, and to the financial aspects, right? So everybody's learning different pieces there at the same time. And, you know, for issues that we may not have technical expertise on, bringing someone on in those meetings, talking about that. And so everybody has not just a moment to understand what's happening, but to weigh in and to ask questions and to kind of raise their kind of collective knowledge around it. And so we see it, you know, also that in that way, right? We're also trying to build different capacities and skills in all of our members because of what you were talking about, I think, Wyman, in the beginning, right? If someone has that capacity and ends up leaving the co-op, what happens then?
Right. Thank you. Jen, what's your experience with training and education when you began your project, and are there things you do different today?
I think we started out with Winthrop very strong on training and education. We did a very lengthy training, 7 sessions with everybody in the cooperative. You had to complete 5 of the 7 to become a member. So it covered a lot of different aspects of the cooperative and really started us out very, very strong on a very strong footing. Since then, I think the ongoing education continues to be a question, and it's only being reinforced. And as I hear our colleagues today, I'm like, okay, we need to make sure we're continuing to do that, build that into the budget. We did a retreat pre-pandemic. We did a board retreat, And I thought that that was a really good way for the board to come together again and recommit to a bit of learning again about their role as board members. And I think that that's, you know, in the day-to-day, it's really easy to lose sight of that. And I think that retreat was a good reset for the board to get to, you know, what is their plan? What is their responsibility? What are their roles as board members? But then I think that we ended up going through a property management transition that really created a lot of ups and downs for the board over the next 6 to 8 months. And I will tell you, I mean, they grew a lot in that time. And I think that they ended up taking real ownership of their role as board members and selecting a property manager. But it still is one of the biggest pain points of how to work with a property manager. And so I think if I, you know, looking back and as I look at all the lessons learned, I think the continuing education around not only what does it mean to be a cooperative member, but how do you work effectively with your property manager and manage your property manager is an ongoing issue that I think that Winthrop is continuing to wrestle with. What you expect of your property manager, what should you not expect of your property manager, and understanding your role, the role of the board member versus the role of the property manager. So if I had hindsight being 2020, I would invest a little bit more time in continuing education, especially on board roles as well as on property management.
Thank you. And Audrey, how did you handle that training when you began your co-op, and are there lessons today that you would do things maybe slightly different?
I believe Audrey dropped off one minute.
Yeah, Audrey had to step out.
Okay, so just I'm going to shift now then to opening up for audience questions, but I want to piggyback on Jen's comment. My experience on property managers is that if you're doing a co-op, you can't hire a property manager whose portfolio is rental. And I've learned this from larger developers who do rental, and they figured out when they shifted to condo and ownership that they start having problems. And it's one thing when you are the property manager and you're basically providing services to your customer versus the tenant of your customer. And so that is a key factor, is what type of property management you have. And you must have experienced property management who has experience better in co-ops, but in homeowner associations or condominiums or other association of owners of which they're overseeing their property. With that, you've heard a number of key items of how each of our co-ops have developed, how they manage, how they handle training, how they handle equity. And now we want to open it up for the last part of our session to the audience. And I think you have the ability to raise your hand. And if you'd like to raise your hand versus simply putting a text in the chat, you can do that now, and I'll recognize you and allow you to ask questions of our panel.
And wait a minute, just a quick housekeeping piece. It is now 11:35. This session has another good 10 minutes to it. So I'm asking questions to be clarifying questions or key questions as opposed to statements, so we could try to get as many voices in as possible. So please keep your questions to under a minute at all possible.
Thank you. Questions for our panel? Am I seeing any hands raised?
I have a question, Wyman, because I know you used to work in South Shore.
Yeah.
You know, we think there's just so many commonalities really between co-ops and condos, because without engaged, empowered, you know, kind of motivated residents, the real estate market will crush you, right?
Yes.
And I thought maybe you could talk a little bit about all the conversions over years in South Shore and other, you know, markets, really back and forth, rental, co-op, condo, and what you saw in South Shore.
Well, again, guys, my experience was at the beginning of the emerging co-op market in Chicago. As I said, when I started, Bickerdike was there, Bethel New Life, Woodlawn, just to name a few who were involved in development. South Shore was by the time I arrived there in 78, 79, it had a solid African-American middle class. And they were taking advantage of being able to live on the lakefront and to be less than 10 minutes from downtown Chicago. And one of the things, Joy, I always remember when we look at square footage costs in like Logan Square and those neighborhoods that Bickerdike worked, and seeing 2 to 3 times greater square foot costs being in a lakefront community than South Shore, it really saw that we didn't have those same pressures. And that was because of segregation and redlining, right?
Mhm.
In fact, before African Americans were redlined, the community redlining actually began when Jews started moving in the South Shore in the 40s. So just to show you that this dynamic was occurring long before African Americans arrived there. But there was a class dichotomy also, and that class dichotomy was that you had a Black middle class, but you had a Black underclass that were renting, and they were in horrible conditions. And I saw conditions in South Shore around that time. The HUD started forcing cities and local communities to follow relocation acts. That is, if the city of Chicago takes your building, Joy, it must pay relocation benefits to you, the owner, and the tenants. And what the city started doing was that if it acquired the building for you, it would say, hey, Joy, there's these costs that the federal government is requiring and we can't dodge them. We're going to put them on you. And what you start seeing in South Shore was a process where you come home from work and your 36 unit walk up and there's no power because someone has pulled the junction box, right? They basically have destroyed the electrical system. There's power that can come in, but there's nowhere for the power to be distributed. That would then trigger a building inspector, and the building inspector would vacate the building. And if the building inspector would vacate the building, the parties, either the public or private, would take title. If there were no residents there, you didn't have relocation requirements. And I remember working with a number of groups, including Bickerdike, and a group of attorneys where we were going into Chicago courts to make the argument that Geraldine lived there up until this date, and to get the court to recognize that she was in fact an urban refugee and had been displaced by a combination of private policy working in collaboration with private interests against Geraldine. And it was a really attempt to, which is why rental is so important, is that the law says Geraldine don't own it, so she ain't recognized. Just not recognized. But Kevin, if he owned it and had title, could be recognized. And again, that was the early period. And of course, there was, as in many communities, real disdain for co-ops. And so that's where but what made all this work was that education. Educating people that there was an alternative to being forced out of your building, and there were choices to avoid being displaced by having rent increases that was well beyond what your wages could pay. Any other questions or comments, Rachel, Janae, or other members?
It looks like Sheila's son has a question for you, Wyman. Right.
Please, Sheila.
Well, I have two questions. One on behalf of someone who ask a question in the chat, so I'm gonna ask that one first, which is there anyone on the panel or in our audience today that has experience in rural communities? I ask a bunch of questions in the chat, so I'm ceding my space.
I guess that would be me. You mean rural co-ops?
Yes, that was asked in the chat by, I think Ramona, I think was her name. I'm sorry. Yes, Ramona Taylor Williams, I think. Yeah.
I have some experience, but it hasn't been housing. It's been a 40,000 square foot co-op grocery store in Menominee, Wisconsin, that is an extraordinary food desert. And but for they started out with a little storefront, but they did something else. Wisconsin has phenomenal statutes, and they were able to raise a little under $2 million in the form of preferred shares. In other words, Wisconsin provides co-op an additional way to raise equity without impinging on the equity of the members. And that was a real lesson for me of these new sources of raising capital that they use to finance. A second one was a project I did with North Country there. This may be true for Illinois also, is mobile homes. Typically, mobile homes have a owner who owns the land, and then you bring your mobile unit there and lease it. But guess what's been occurring since 2020? Warren Buffett has been buying all of the land contracts. And Sheila, think of it this way: Warren Buffett buy the land that your mobile unit sits on. What happens when he raises the rents? And remember, these are not mobile units you pick up and move to another spot. They're put there. And so that I work with North County, and typically what occurs is that these mobile homes are two populations. They're young Latinx, just starting their families, low-income workers, and white, blue-collar retirees. Really the same class. The difference is generational. One is that they have retired, the kids are grown, the other are just beginning their work life. There's a language difference, but these are the people who lived in these properties in Wisconsin, and their challenge was to keep the Warren Buffetts from buying. And so with North County, we set up a structure where they own their mobile, but they created a co-op, really a land trust that would own the land, but they also finance, which is usually issue. They did some work to improve roads, to get into the mobile, and sometimes making improvements to water and sanitation are almost always the rules that you have in these rural communities. And so beyond being rural, the same challenges you heard from the co-ops today in Chicago are exactly the same in the rural communities. There really is no difference between what you go through if you're in Ladysmith, population 2,800 versus Chicago, population millions. Second question.
Wait a minute, I'm just gonna give you it is 11:44. We can expand ourselves for another 5 minutes or so, but we do need to wrap up.
Any other questions for the panel?
So I did have a question about the balance between, this is just a maintaining the balance between sort of customization of units and then the responsibility of the co-op to ensure that there's a quality that's somewhat standard, so that if that person does want to pass on that unit, kind of like, how do you balance that private ownership piece where, if someone puts in, let's say, really expensive tile or something that's really expensive to maintain, right? That's going to be an expense if there's a repair. I'm trying to get at this sort of crux of like, there's an affordability piece and there's an individual piece and there's a co-op responsibility piece. And how do people balance that?
There actually were a couple of the panelists, Sheila, that talked about how they handle that. And so I just turned on my panelists. I'm drawing a blank on whether that was Logan Square or
It was Audrey. It was
Audrey.
Audrey, and her internet went out. She sent me a note.
okay.
So if I can chime in here. So there's a lot of different models to that. I'm gonna make the answer short. There's a lot of different models to that, and it all begins with the covenant, the bylaws, and the organizational culture of that property. And so even in a condo setting, I live in a condo presently, right? One can over equitize, but there are some spaces and places that there needs to be uniformity. I cannot put, I'm right on the lakefront, you know, I cannot put a window that is so different from all the other windows in my unit because the condo association has some say in keeping some level of uniformity and costs envelop. I don't know the right English word, but kind of the envelope that the wrapping you put around all of this. It is even more so important in a co-op because, again, as you said, if I'm going to put in these expensive tile that's hard to manage, and the next owner that is able to afford this cannot afford to maintain that tile, it becomes a problem with sustainability. So most co-ops will have within their covenant and bylaws, right, what you can and cannot do. Again, this is where owner education comes in. What I tell people about cooperatives is you don't own the unit. The unit is owned collectively. Your certificate of ownership, right, is that you can show for is that unit. But if you were to buy a investment piece to Amazon, you can't walk into Amazon and say, I'm an investor and I want this all blue today. No, there's uniformities within that agreement of how you as an investor can interface with the product. The same thing with cooperatives.
That's what I was getting to. Thank you so much. That's the answer I was curious about.
All right.
Thank you, Janae. Any other questions for the panel?
I have one, which is, I wanted to hear from the panelists, kind of future things they're working on. I know Yvonne had talked a little bit about they got their second property and they're moving that forward. I'd like to hear from the other panelists, kind of what is some of their future things that they have in the hopper or looking into around this space of shared ownership.
Joy? Unmute yourself. There you go.
So we don't have any other co-op developments in mind, although it is always in my mind about, you know, how to, you know, if we were going to do another home ownership project, it would be a co-op. And, you know, we try to manage the apartments that we have in a fashion that engages the residents in their housing. Again, getting away from people's investment in their housing having to do with money as opposed to, you know, quality of life. And but I do think that it's a good question, and I take that challenge to heart about, you know, keeping it in mind, especially since the environment is so much less hostile to co-ops. It might seem like that's an overstatement, but let me tell you, 20 years ago, it was so different than today.
Yeah, you could cut it with a knife. Ivan, would you answer Janae's question?
Yeah, I think just really briefly, beyond the second building, another thing we're really working on is to try and really push city policies forward, especially around the ARO, you know, and how to sort of make those funds available more, you know, quickly, because obviously, you know, when you're looking at competing with developers and with folks that are paying cash and prices continue to, you know, only increase, it just makes it that much harder to get into buildings, and they could do a lot with that space to really support us. So that's one thing we're looking at.
Molly?
I think just working within an affordable housing organization that does mostly rentals, I think we've sort of hit on something. I think there's a lot of interest in what we do here and how to replicate it across our portfolio. I mean, I think our main mission will continue to be rental housing, but there is a great interest in preservation. Preservation is a lot of things. Preservation is absolutely the good work that Jen did in Edgewater. And I think we may see more interest and openness to sort of facilitating those types of relationships. So I think this will be a model that we'll put in our toolbox going forward. POAH has done some work with wealth development. We work a lot with HUD's family self-sufficiency program, allowing people to bank the appreciation in their income so that they could go on to buy a house. And that's a major part of our work in terms of resident services. And I think that could sort of spin off in this shared ownership housing opportunities as well. So.
And Jen?
Yeah, so Habitat, it really is squarely focused on home ownership as overall, and that's the work that we do day in and day out. And so one is that we've been doing a lot of single family home development over the last several years. And so we're actually working with our neighbors right now, a lot of our homeowners, and facilitating conversations. They all live because we take a very neighborhood focused approach to our work. So our team is engaging with those homeowners and neighbors around what are the shared elements, what are the things they care about, how can they work together collectively to advance their neighborhood goals. And then part two of that answer, I would say, is that we are also starting to work on the development of a townhome development. So that has also shared elements to it. And so we're planning around what are those shared elements, how do we get in front of this at the neighborhood level and getting neighbors engaged in conversation around this townhome development. And then also how do we, as we move forward in the development of that townhome project, making sure we're adding education on the very front end and then all the way through to post purchase support. And so building that out.
Thank you. Janae, Rachel, I'll turn it back over to you guys.